First of all, describe what the past month has been for you.
It's been absolutely terrible, as it is for everyone. I mean, you see us in press conference. You haven't seen me as much in the media, but you see our families and the raw emotion that's out there, and the grief, the frustration. You know, we go through a range of emotions, from anger to frustration to grief. For me, it comes at different times during the day. 2 weeks ago, I knew exactly what to do. I'd go to the volunteer center at the Red Lion and open up the center and wait for the volunteers to come and work on things. And then I'd go out and put up flyers.
Hello?
Amber?
Yes.
Scott continues to call Amber, and detectives are intent on getting him to repeat something he told her just before Laci disappeared. Those 4 short but incriminating words, "I lost my wife."
You came and told me this elaborate lie about her missing and this tragedy, and that...
No.
And that this will be the first holidays without her?
Yeah, I never said. Amber, God, I don't want to fight with you. You know that I never said tragedy or missing.
Oh, yes, you said you've lost your wife.
No. Yes.
Obviously without me saying much. But we will...
I said that I lost my wife.
Yes, you did.
I did.
Bingo. This is what investigators needed.
For us, that was a huge statement on his part, because how do you predict that? I mean, how do you you're going to come up with a lie about that to try and woo some girl into a romance that you're not supposed to be part of, and then all of a sudden it comes true? I mean, the odds of that are pretty far out there.
The calls continue and Scott's lies pile up.
Welcome back to the channel. Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking about convicted killer Scott Peterson. Peterson was convicted for the murder of his wife, Laci Peterson, and their unborn son, Connor. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. He has always maintained his innocence, and there was never any, from what I remember, his trial was back in 2000, I believe it was 2004. So at that point I was in high school and I vaguely remember it, so I don't have it super in my mind. But what I do have in my mind is I remember at the time it was, from what I recall, his behavior that convinced me he was guilty, but there was never any like smoking gun evidence. Everything, all the evidence against him was circumstantial. So I have an article here from LA Magazine. Los Angeles Innocence Project agrees to examine Scott Peterson conviction. California man convicted of killing his wife Laci and their unborn son in 2004, which became a sensational case that captivated the nation. Yeah, from what I recall, this was a huge media frenzy. It was right at the time where, you know, you were getting that kind of like 24-hour news. We were just kind of starting to get the rise of the internet, but it was still at the point where everybody watched cable news for everything. So you would come home. It's not like you had all these different YouTube channels to choose from. This was a story that made national news, and it was something that all of the country followed this trial at the time, and people had very strong opinions. And from what I remember, Scott Peterson was sort of convicted in the media. He just like, well, he lied so many times, and his personality, like he came off as such an asshole, to be fair. And so, yeah, I do remember it being this big media circus. So the LA Innocence Project has agreed to examine the case. It's a major development for the 51-year-old who has maintained his innocence and maintained he was wrongly convicted for 2 decades. Now, it should be pointed out, too, that Peterson has appealed, and his appeals have been so far unsuccessful. So the case has been litigated. He is convicted. You know, he was originally on death row, and then as part of his appeal, they brought forward some evidence about potential juror bias, and I believe that was what reduced him to from being on death row to just having life in prison. But he's always maintained that he was innocent. In court filings, lawyers for the vaunted nonprofit, we're going to call it that, really, argue new evidence supports Peterson's, quote, claim of actual innocence and, quote, raises many questions into who abducted and killed Laci and Connor Peterson. In a statement, the LA Innocence Project said it was, quote, investigating his claim of actual innocence. His lawyer said in a statement he felt, quote, gratified the Innocence Project has stepped in. As for 20 years, I've always thought this was an injustice. On Christmas Eve 2002, investigators in Modesto received a frantic call from Peterson, who claimed he returned home from a fishing trip in Berkeley to find that his wife, Laci, nearly 8 months pregnant with their son, Connor, had disappeared. The case of the pretty and pregnant missing 27-year-old captivated the country. When the days stretched on with no sign of the soon-to-be mom, attention settled on one prime suspect, Scott Peterson. Again, very unlikable character. The body of Laci and her unborn son were recovered in the San Francisco Bay in April 2003. By then, prosecutors said Peterson had sold his wife's car and turned their son's nursery into a storage room. Worse, a woman named Amber Fry, it's spelled Frey, it's pronounced Fry, came forward and announced to investigators and the media she was in this relationship with Scott Peterson, and that he told her his wife was dead before those bodies were recovered. So he was carrying on like an affair, and he basically, I guess you could say, he was living two different lives, and he was telling her, Amber Fry, his mistress, that his wife was dead, and you know, he was giving her this sob story, probably in order to manipulate her. Peterson was convicted at a 2004 trial after prosecutors argued he killed Laci Christmas Eve and dumped her body off his fishing boat, and was sentenced to death. This is one of the infamous jurors there. She was called Strawberry Shortcake. Since then, Garagos, along with attorney Cliff Gardner, have strenuously maintained Peterson's innocence as they pushed for a new trial, arguing his right to a fair trial was tainted by a compromised juror. Garagos charged that Richelle Nice, a woman nicknamed Strawberry Shortcake because of her bright red hair, had lied to the court when she said she'd never been the victim of a crime or been involved in a lawsuit. She was initially appointed as an alternate juror, but became juror number 7 after 2 jurors were dismissed. According to Peterson's legal team's court filings during legal proceedings years earlier, Nice had testified she had been the victim of domestic violence and had, quote, fears for her unborn child, which the attorney contended was grounds for a new trial because of perceived bias she may have fostered for Peterson. Now, again, they did not agree. They overturned his death penalty in December 2021, but he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So he was not given a new trial based on just that. So unless there's more, then it's already been litigated. A court denied his request for a retrial, writing that the jurors' responses, quote, were not motivated by pre-existing or improper bias against Peterson, but were the result of a combination of a good faith misunderstanding of the questions and sloppiness in answering. The judge wrote, to be fair, I think that's BS. The Whitmer case had an issue with juror bias as well. And that is one of the issues that they are putting up on appeal, that they're bringing forward on appeal. So I think that's a legitimate issue. Garagos called her ruling a, quote, disturbing threat to due process, and said it set a troubling precedent if jurors are allowed to lie. Quote, I only accepted this alternate juror on the basis of her statements in sworn under oath testimony. This is a really disturbing decision for anyone who picks a jury. It means you're not supposed to believe what people are telling you under oath. So, his lawyers pointed out that in a court's brief seeking a new trial, that the juror Nice's lies may not have been sloppy. She later wrote Peterson dozens of letters while he was on death row and co-authored the book We the Jury with other Peterson jurors and became a media fixture, commenting about the trial on 2020 News Nation, American Justice, True Hollywood Story, and the documentary The Murder of Laci Peterson. And so I don't know what the implication there would be that maybe she's grifting off of like being a juror in the case and, you know, is making money from her involvement in it. So perhaps she's got reasons to like embellish the story or whatever. This is an article, though, from the San Francisco Chronicle titled "Why the LA Innocence Project Wants to Exonerate Scott Peterson." The LA Innocence Project has filed court papers in an effort to exonerate Peterson, contending key evidence was withheld from the 2004 trial that found him guilty of killing his pregnant wife Laci and their unborn son. The filings made Wednesday in San Mateo County Superior Court contain nearly 1,000 pages of evidence that the project says will show other suspects were not fully considered, and that a mysterious van that was set on fire across from the Petersons' Modesto home contained blood spatter that might have cleared the convicted man. The van, plus some purported sightings of Laci before her disappearance and traces after it, weren't properly presented at the trial, which was moved from Stanislaus County to San Mateo because of the enormous publicity surrounding the case, which again was massive. And I hope I'm pronouncing the names wrong. If I'm mispronouncing them, please forgive me. Let me know in the comments. The project asks that DNA testing be done on the blood and the previously unheard interviews with witnesses who cast doubt on the guilt of Peterson be examined by the court. Paula Mitchell, director of the LA Innocence Project, said in the filings that much of what she and her team discovered could possibly turn the verdict around. She said Peterson contacted her office in March 2023 and asked her to look into the case. Quote, based on my review of the evidence presented at trial in this case and the new evidence uncovered, I believe that additional relevant and material information and evidence exists that relate to the claims raised in the pro se petition before the court. So Peterson, because he's no longer on death row, he lost his basically court-appointed lawyer, so he's now essentially representing himself. So he made that pro se petition. And she says that will support his claims of innocence. The LA Innocence Project, housed at Cal State LA, quote, works to exonerate the wrongfully convicted who are serving lengthy sentences in California prisons, unquote, according to its mission statement. The Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office wrote back to the project in December that the project's contentions appeared to be faulty after receiving a letter requesting evidence. Quote, your 64-page request lists a few items which were purportedly not included in the initial discovery to defendant Peterson's original trial counsel and several other items. Special Prosecutor Birgit Flatiger wrote in the response, however, quote, you may not be aware, but it was our team that brought newly discovered information to the attention of Peterson's lawyers and the court during his last habeas corpus matter, she added. In her letter, Flatiger also accused Innocence Project's attorneys of deliberately withholding information about their efforts to exonerate Peterson, calling into question the, quote, suggested intent of their requests for evidence. Quote, the fact that you've chosen to withhold items you claim to possess that support some of your assertions is troubling. Pat Harris, one of Peterson's defense attorneys in many court appearances, said he intends to help in the new efforts. Quote, we're very excited to have the incredible attorneys at the LA Innocence Project lend their unparalleled expertise to helping to prove Scott Peterson's innocence. He wrote in an email to the Chronicle. The LA Innocence Project's court filing was first reported by ABC News. One of the network's retired producers and investigative reporters is included in their filing with a lengthy declaration saying he thinks that the case should be re-examined. Peterson, now 51, was working for a fertilizer company when his wife, who was 8 months pregnant, disappeared December 24, 2002. The search for her stretched throughout Northern California and grabbed national attention. In a media frenzy in April, became a frenzy in April when the bodies of Laci and her baby were found separately on the shoreline. Peterson said he'd gone fishing around the same time in the waters off Berkeley. And between that and revelations he'd been having an extramarital affair, suspicions centered on him. He was sent to death row after his convictions, but after court findings, a juror in the case had failed to disclose previous involvement in legal proceedings, the state Supreme Court overturned that sentence. He was then resentenced to life in prison without parole. The Innocence Project says it's reviewing everything involved in his trial, which includes at least 43,000 pages of discovery, testimony, and more than 150 witnesses and 120 volumes of documents. So that's quite a lot. I wanted to bring this up. This may be the guy here. He says, I asked Scott Peterson's sister-in-law, Janie Peterson, whether she... So his family is very supportive of him, at least his sister is. She believes he's innocent, and I know she's been saying that for a long time. He says, I asked Peterson's sister-in-law whether she sees the Innocence Project motions as a real shot at a new trial. Quote, absolutely, she texted, or solving the crime and Scott being released. The family credits a retired ABC News producer with finding new evidence in the death of Laci Peterson in December 2002 and raising doubts. My cudgel tells me, quote, the verdict was unsatisfactory. I was really conflicted about the case because there wasn't really an explanation of what really happened to Laci. It was really a mystery. And so I wanted to bring this up just to remind people of what Peterson had on him when he was on his way to, quote, play golf without any golf clubs in tow. This is when he was arrested. He had his brother's ID with dyed hair to match, $15,000 in cash, 4 different cell phones, a tarp, a knife, duct tape, rope, a shovel, and the address and directions to Amber Fry's place of employment. Look at all this stuff in the exhibits here of everything he had on him at the time. Oh, I was just going to play golf. Well, sir, where's the golf equipment? You know, I think that's a little sus, guys. X to doubt. Okay, so I wanted to bring up this thread by Delane Esper on X. This is in response to the notice here from ABC News about the Innocence Project taking on the case. He says the first thing that you have to understand is what we know about the Innocence Project. It's put a brand name on a revolution in criminal forensics in the 90s and 2000s where DNA tests became super accurate. Obviously, prosecutors and police love DNA. We've seen it used to solve all sorts of crimes, including cold cases like the Golden State Killer. But defense lawyers, who were always convinced the system might catch a lot of innocent people, like DNA too. 2 very skilled defense lawyers, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, set out to master the technology, convinced DNA tests of old evidence could exonerate convicts and get innocent people out of prison. They first ran it as a law school clinic and called it the Innocence Project. It worked spectacularly well because it turned out Scheck and Neufeld were right. There were plenty of people fingered by unreliable witnesses, unreliable jailhouse snitches, police perjury, and other unreliable forms of evidence. The DNA told the tale and sprung them. But what you have to understand about that was it was basically a one-off. New police investigations use DNA evidence and therefore benefit from the accuracy of that. Many old cases have little or no preserved evidence with usable DNA on it, or the defendant was guilty. So as they ran out of cases of actual innocence disclosed by DNA evidence, the Innocence Project was left with a lot of funding and not a lot left to do. Over time, they've turned into a pretty standard criminal defense firm that takes on high-profile cases. There's nothing wrong with this. Everyone accused of a crime deserves a good defense. One benefit of having good defense lawyers is when innocent people do unfairly get suspected, they're much more likely to get acquitted. This is a very real social need. You could just look at the Whitmer case as examples that people who were forced to rely on court-appointed attorneys didn't have the best legal team for a high-profile national case of the kind that it was, and I think that was a huge problem. What you have to understand is that most people who get prosecuted for serious crimes are in fact guilty. I am going to disagree. When you evolve into a normal criminal defense firm, you know you're no longer representing only innocent people. You are representing a few innocents and a lot of others. Further, Scheck and Neufeld have a sort of double history, even on the DNA evidence that made them famous. From the very start, while trumpeting DNA as a way to exonerate defendants, they also perfected a set of arguments defense lawyers can use to undermine DNA tests. this was extensively discussed in Jeffrey Toobin's, yes, that Toobin's, The Run of His Life book about the O.J. Simpson trial. The DNA evidence in the O.J. Simpson case was conclusive, but Scheck and Neufeld, with tons of O.J.'s money at their disposal, developed arguments against DNA. And if you're anything of a true crime buff, you've heard the arguments in other cases. DNA is all either contaminated, degraded, planted, blood drops just happen to fall where existing DNA is located, nowhere else. You know, that could happen. Toobin discusses candidly why this happened, because at the bottom, they're basically defense attorneys. The Innocence Project has great branding, but at the end of the day, like all defense lawyers, they're trying to get clients off. None of this is in any way wrong or unethical, but it is inconsistent with the branding, and that's what I think of them taking on Scott Peterson. It's not inconsistent with their actual mission, but inconsistent with their branding. Peterson's case is exactly the sort of case that happens in the real world, where prosecutors don't bring cases against provably and obviously innocent people, but do sometimes bring cases that they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that's an important distinction to make. Because this case is obviously very different from like the Whitmer case and what we've discussed with the corruption there. So Peterson's very pregnant wife disappeared while he was having an affair. He went to great lengths not to tell his mistress he was married. Again, that doesn't prove he's a murderer. Actually pretending to be in Paris while on the phone with his mistress from a candlelight vigil for his wife's disappearance. That was very gross. And again, it was things like these behaviors that, you know, at least at the very least made him suspicious and highly unlikable. He also, importantly, eventually admitted to his mistress he was married, but said he had lost his wife, and this was at a time when there was an active search campaign for his wife. Plus, Peterson had bought a brand new boat just before she disappeared. His alibi was the day of her disappearance was he was out at Berkeley Marina taking a fishing trip. They ended up finding her body on the shore of San Francisco Bay, right near Berkeley Marina, so they arrested him and charged him. Maybe the biggest piece of evidence was he made concrete weights and then couldn't explain where they disappeared to. Despite that, he put on a vigorous defense. His wife's body had been in the bay so long there was no forensic evidence to be done on it. They could not prove how she died. The only biological evidence was a piece of her hair caught in a tool on the boat. There were questions about whether he could actually throw his pregnant wife overboard from his rickety boat. It was far from an airtight case. Now, importantly, he did not get a fair trial. A juror who lied about her experiences with spousal abuse got onto the jury as an alternate and became the biggest advocate for his conviction and giving him the death penalty. So he's got a plausible case for a new trial, which is totally within the remit of criminal defense lawyers. The only issue is that they brand themselves as the Innocence Project, and the chances of Peterson being actually innocent seem pretty low. I have to agree. More likely, Peterson belongs to a much larger category of probably guilty people who didn't get fair trials. And to be clear, that's not unimportant, because in a fair trial, he had a real chance of acquittal or a hung jury, and that is his right. Remember, just because someone might not be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean they didn't do it. They may be exactly where Peterson's case, lies. I think that was a good point. There's also this thread here on Reddit going into part of the reasons why they believe Scott Peterson is guilty. And I mean, there's quite a lot. Like, a lot of this stuff is circumstantial, or it could just point to him being a bad person. But when you really get into it, it's like, yeah, the chances of him being innocent is probably quite low, but there is a chance, and I think that does merit a fair trial. I think if his rights were denied because of that juror, then yes, he should get a new trial, and she has nobody to thank for that but herself. This is why you don't lie under oath. I'm going to include this link here. This talks about someone who claimed to see Laci Peterson walking the dog. In spite of prosecution's insistence, Laci Peterson had stopped walking her dog Mackenzie 2 months prior to her disappearance. There's information in testimony and in police, media, and medical reports to prove otherwise. This is from January 3rd, 2003. So they talk about this, the fact that she may have been seen walking the dog on the day that she disappeared. And there was apparently some kind of burglary that occurred, and they were initially, prosecutors said that happened on the 26th of December, but Peterson's team maintained it happened the day that she went missing. And so I guess make of that what you will. I will include all of these links in the video description. I'm not really interested in going over this case again. There are other people who are much better at that than me, but I am interested. What do you guys think of the case? Number one, what do you think of Scott Peterson? Do you think he's guilty or innocent? And what do you think of the LA Innocence Project taking up the case and this supposed new evidence that we haven't seen yet? I'm interested. I'm always interested to hear what you guys think. So that's it. That's all for now. Have a good day, guys.